Canada just did something that has Washington quietly furious. While American regulators are still buried in paperwork, debating frameworks, and scheduling committee meetings about the future of urban air mobility, Canada opened its doors to something the United States has been desperately trying to develop for years. A Chinese company just received approval to begin operating electric flying cars on Canadian soil, not testing them in a closed facility, not running them over an empty field somewhere, actually flying them over populated areas, carrying real passengers as a commercial service. And the technology works. That is the part that is making this so uncomfortable for everyone south of the border. This is not a prototype story. This is not a maybe someday story. This is happening right now in 2026 in cities that share a border with the United States, operated by a Chinese aerospace company that most Americans have never heard of, but absolutely should know about, because what just landed in Canada is not just a new vehicle. It is a signal about who is actually leading the next era of transportation. And the answer is making a lot of powerful people in Washington very, very nervous. To understand why this moment matters, you need to understand where it came from. The company at the center of this story is EHang, and their flagship aircraft is called the EH216-S. It looks exactly like what you would get if someone took a large drone and decided to make it big enough to sit two people inside. 16 propellers arranged across 8 arms, fully electric, fully autonomous, no pilot required, no joystick, no controls inside the cabin at all. You get in, you select your destination, and the aircraft flies itself. That last part is what separates EHang from almost every other company in the flying car space. Most competitors are building vehicles that still require a trained pilot or at least a licensed operator. EHang removed the human from the equation entirely and put the intelligence in the software. The aircraft communicates constantly with a ground control center that monitors the flight in real time, can intervene remotely if needed, and manages the entire operation the way air traffic control manages conventional aircraft, except with far more data, far more precision, and far faster response times than any human controller could manage manually. EHang has been building toward this moment for over a decade. Founded in 2014 in Guangzhou, the company spent its early years doing what most dismissed as an expensive fantasy. They built prototype after prototype. They flew thousands of test flights. They gathered safety data on a scale that no Western competitor has come close to matching. And in 2023, they received something that stopped the global aerospace industry in its tracks. The Civil Aviation Administration of China issued EHang the world's first type certificate for an autonomous passenger carrying aircraft, not a special exemption, not a limited test permit, a full type certificate, the same category of regulatory approval that certifies a Boeing or an Airbus is safe to carry passengers commercially. That certification was the moment everything changed, because once you have demonstrated to one major aviation regulator that your aircraft meets the safety threshold for commercial passenger operations, every other regulator in the world has to start taking you seriously. The question stops being, could this ever work, and becomes, when and where does this start? Canada answered that question. In early 2026, Transport Canada, the federal body responsible for aviation regulation in the country, granted EHang operational approval to begin commercial passenger flights with the EH216-S in designated Canadian corridors. The approval came with conditions, specific flight zones, altitude restrictions, weather limitations, and mandatory ground control oversight for every flight. But those conditions exist for every new aviation category when it first enters commercial operation. They are the starting point, not the ceiling. The initial routes being established connect urban centers with airports, waterfronts, and high-density tourist destinations. Think of the kind of short-haul trips that currently require an expensive helicopter, charter, or a lengthy drive through city traffic. A 15-minute drive that takes 45 minutes because of congestion, a trip to an island that requires a ferry, a transfer between a downtown hotel and an airport that sits just far enough outside the city to be genuinely inconvenient. These are the routes EHang is targeting first, and they are targeting them at a price point designed to make the service accessible rather than exclusive. The EH216-S has a range of approximately 30 kilometers on a full charge and a top speed of 130 kilometers per hour. Each flight carries up to 2 passengers. The aircraft takes off and lands vertically, meaning it does not need a runway, just a small flat pad. Charge time between flights is under an hour with fast charging infrastructure in place. The operating cost per flight, when scaled across a network of aircraft and charging stations, comes out significantly lower than helicopter operations, which is the only remotely comparable service that currently exists at this scale. For Canadian cities already dealing with infrastructure strain, housing density, and the particular geography of a country where wilderness and urban centers often sit uncomfortably close together, an autonomous air taxi network is not a futuristic luxury. It is a practical solution to real problems that roads and rails have never been able to fully solve. Here is where it gets complicated. The United States has been pouring money into urban air mobility for years. NASA has funded research programs. The FAA has been working on regulatory frameworks. American startups like Joby Aviation, Archer, and Wisk have raised billions of dollars in venture capital and are working toward their own certification timelines. The political and financial investment in American companies winning this space has been enormous. And yet, as of 2026, none of them are carrying paying passengers commercially, not one. The FAA certification process for new aircraft categories is notoriously slow, notoriously complex, and notoriously risk-averse in ways that make sense from a pure safety standpoint, but create a structural disadvantage when a competitor has already received certification from another major regulator and started building real-world operational data while American companies are still in certification limbo. The frustration runs deeper than just the regulatory timeline. There is a political dimension here that Washington has been very deliberate about. The United States has spent considerable effort over the past several years restricting Chinese technology companies from operating in American infrastructure. Huawei was effectively banned from U.S. telecommunications networks. TikTok faced years of national security scrutiny. DJI drones, made by a Chinese company that happens to be headquartered in the same city as EHang, are subject to restrictions in U.S. federal government procurement. The underlying concern in every one of those cases is the same. Chinese technology embedded in critical infrastructure creates potential vectors for data collection and remote access that U.S. national security officials consider unacceptable. An autonomous flying vehicle operated by a Chinese company running on Chinese software, communicating with Chinese-operated ground control systems, flying over populated Canadian cities that sit minutes from the U.S. border, hits essentially every nerve that American national security policy has been trying to protect. The aircraft knows where it is, it knows where it has been, it knows who was on board, and all of that data flows through systems that are ultimately rooted in China. Canada's position on this is more pragmatic and considerably less alarmed. Canadian regulators evaluated the aircraft on its aviation safety merits and found it met the standard. The national security framing that dominates the American conversation about Chinese technology has not so far driven Canadian aviation policy in the same direction. There is something else sitting underneath this story that is deeply uncomfortable for the American aerospace industry, and it has nothing to do with regulation or geopolitics. It has to do with where the technology actually stands right now. EHang's EH216-S has logged more autonomous passenger flight hours than any comparable Western aircraft. By a significant margin, the safety record that supported their Chinese type certificate was built on data from thousands of flights in real conditions, not simulations. The ground control software has been refined through actual operational experience. The battery management systems have been tested through repeated charge cycles at scale. The redundancy architecture, the system of backups and fail-safes that ensures the aircraft keeps flying even when individual components fail has been validated in ways that look extremely different from PowerPoint presentations and controlled test environments. Western competitors are building excellent aircraft. The engineering talent working at Joby, at Archer, at Lilium before its financial difficulties is genuinely world-class. But there is a difference between having an excellent aircraft design and having an aircraft that has actually been flying at scale long enough to surface and solve the problems that only real-world operation reveals. EHang has that operational history. Most of its competitors do not yet. The bet that much of the American industry made was that the FAA certification process would be the great equalizer, that the rigorous standards demanded by the world's most influential aviation regulator would ultimately force every player to meet the same bar, and that American companies operating in the world's most demanding regulatory environment would emerge from that process with aircraft that were definitively safer and more refined than anything that had taken a faster path through a less demanding regulator. That argument still has merit. FAA certification carries weight globally, and any aircraft that achieves it will be taken seriously in markets around the world. But the argument has a timing problem. Canada is not waiting for FAA certification to let EHang fly. And if the Canadian operation builds a strong safety record over the next year or two, the pressure on other countries to follow suit will become very difficult to resist. First mover advantage in aviation is not just about having the best aircraft, it is about being the company that operators, insurers, infrastructure developers, and city planners have already built their systems around. Step back from the geopolitics and the regulatory debate for a moment and think about what this actually means for someone standing at a waterfront pad in Vancouver or a rooftop terminal in Toronto in 2026. You open an app, you book a flight, you walk to the nearest vertipad, which is what the industry calls the small takeoff and landing platforms being built into urban infrastructure. You get into a vehicle roughly the size of a large SUV. There is no pilot. There are screens showing you flight information. There are windows on all sides. The rotors above you spin up and you lift off. Below you, traffic sits gridlocked on streets designed for a city a third of the current size. In 12 minutes, you land at your destination. The total cost is somewhere between a premium taxi and a budget helicopter charter. That experience, which would have sounded like science fiction 5 years ago, is now a thing you can pay money for in Canada. And the fact that it is a Chinese company providing that experience in a country that shares the longest international border in the world with the United States is not lost on anyone paying attention in Washington. The infrastructure build-out happening alongside the aircraft operations is equally significant. Vertipads are being integrated into existing buildings, transit hubs, and waterfront developments. Charging infrastructure is being installed. Ground control facilities are being set up and staffed. Every piece of that infrastructure, once built, creates switching costs that make it harder for a competitor to come in later and displace the incumbent. The cables are in the walls, the software is running, the staff is trained, the partnerships with city governments and property developers are signed. EHang is not just running flights, it is building an ecosystem, and ecosystems are remarkably difficult to dislodge once they are established. The speed at which urban air mobility has moved from theoretical concept to operational reality has surprised almost everyone, including many of the people working inside the industry. 5 years ago, the standard industry timeline projected commercial passenger operations beginning around 2028 at the earliest, probably 2030 for anything at meaningful scale. EHang just moved that timeline forward by several years in a market that directly borders the United States. American companies are responding with urgency. Joby Aviation has been accelerating its FAA certification timeline. Archer has announced expanded test flight programs. There is renewed political pressure on the FAA to find ways to evaluate new aircraft categories without compromising safety standards, while also not taking so long that the entire market is captured by a competitor before American companies can legally operate. That is an extraordinarily difficult needle to thread, and the people trying to thread it know it. There is also a broader industrial policy question being asked in Washington right now that goes well beyond flying cars. The United States spent decades assuming that its combination of engineering talent, capital markets, and regulatory credibility would ensure American companies led every major new technology category. That assumption has been stress tested repeatedly over the past decade in semiconductors, in electric vehicles, in battery technology, and now in autonomous aviation. Each time the pattern is similar. Chinese companies invested earlier, scaled faster, built operational experience that Western competitors then had to catch up to, and entered markets with products that were cheaper, more mature, and backed by data that took years to accumulate. The flying car moment in Canada is the latest example of that pattern, and it is landing at a time when the political appetite for allowing it to continue is reaching its limit. The question now is not whether autonomous air taxis are real. Canada just answered that definitively. The question is what the next 2 years look like as this technology scales and as the geopolitical pressure around it intensifies. EHang has publicly stated ambitions to expand Canadian operations across multiple cities by 2027. The company is also in advanced discussions with regulators in several European countries, and the momentum created by the Canadian approval makes those conversations considerably easier. Regulators talking to EHang after Canada can look at an operational track record rather than just a certification document. Real flights, real passengers, real safety data accumulated in a Western regulatory environment. That is a fundamentally different conversation than the one that happened before the Canadian approval. On the American side, the most likely near-term development is not a softening of restrictions on Chinese aviation technology, but rather an acceleration of support for domestic competitors. Expect federal procurement commitments for American-made air taxis. Expect streamlined FAA pathways specifically designed to let domestic companies move faster without cutting corners. Expect the national security framing around Chinese autonomous vehicles, which already covers ground-based autonomous cars and drones, to be explicitly extended to cover autonomous aircraft operating near U.S. territory. What is harder to predict is whether any of that will be fast enough. Infrastructure has a way of becoming permanent. The vertipads being built in Canadian cities right now are not going to be torn out if a competitor arrives 2 years later. The operators trained on EHang's ground control software are not going to forget that training because an American alternative eventually gets certified. The partnerships locked in today shape the landscape that everyone operates in tomorrow. The United States built the modern aviation industry. It wrote the safety standards that the entire world adopted. It produced the aircraft that defined commercial flight for a century. The idea that a Chinese company could establish itself as the dominant operator in the emerging autonomous aviation market, starting in a country that sits directly on America's northern border, is not just an economic story. It is a statement about where technological leadership is coming from in the 2020s and who is moving fast enough to turn that leadership into infrastructure that lasts. Canada made a call, the aircraft are flying, and Washington is watching every single flight.